Okay, so good afternoon, stroke, good evening, everybody. It is nearly dark, so I'm going to say good evening. Welcome to our school's lecture series talk. Some of you, I can see some familiar names on the list, so thanks again for coming back to another of our talks. And for those who have not joined one of these, welcome. So these talks are aimed at A-level students and teachers. We're a diverse school with the the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences, and these evening lecture series cover a range of topics and research specialisms that we cover within our school. And tonight, delighted that Dr. Sarah Greene is going to be talking to us on her research, talking to the topic of understanding the causes of mass extinctions. Now, those of you on the call who know me, I'm a human geographer, so I'm going to learn something tonight. So I'm excited about this.
Only if I do my job well.
And I'd like to remind you that there's a Q&A button on the webinar feature. So as we're going along, and if you've got questions for Sarah, please do pop your questions into the Q&A rather than the chat. Let's have them all in the Q&A. And then Sarah will be talking for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. And these can be anything related, obviously, to Sarah's talk and links to your own A-level curriculum. But also, if you've got other questions related to geography, earth and environmental sciences and more broadly, and studying at Birmingham, then you're more than welcome to ask those questions as well. So I'll stop now and hand over to Sarah. Thank you.
Great. You got my slides up then, Sophie?
Yeah, we can see those. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm really excited to be here to talk to you today. As Sophie said, I work in a School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences at Birmingham, but my particular background is that I started as a geologist, and I've sort of moved towards more geographical topics the longer I've been at university and academia, and I'm really excited. Hopefully there are some geographers in the crowd as well, because I think this topic hopefully touches a little bit on some of the things that might be in your curriculum at A-level that you think of as a geography subject, but at university level could sort of be in between or more towards earth sciences. So my background is geology and paleontology, and the study of sort of the climate of the past. And this talk, we're going to talk specifically about a few big mass extinctions and what caused them. So first of all, why study mass extinctions? And I think there's just the reason to start off with that just history generally is fascinating, and natural history in particular. We're just really curious about, where we came from, how we got here, and the history of our planet. And I think that's reason enough in and of itself. That's reason enough to be interested in mass extinctions. But it's not just an esoteric topic that has no relevance as well. In that, studying these past extinction events, we really learn quite a bit about how the Earth works. And what I mean by that is that the Earth is made up of a whole number of different component systems. There's an atmosphere, there's a biosphere, which is life, all life on the planet. There's a hydrosphere, which is oceans and lakes and the water and stuff. And there's a geosphere, which is rock. And all these bits and pieces are interconnected and they all interact. And all of those pieces are probably involved in the causes of these mass extinctions. So unraveling that, what caused the extinction, we kind of understand a bit more about how all those processes and how those systems interlink. How does the atmosphere affect the biosphere? How does the hydrosphere affect the life that lives in it? And, with other sort of STEM subjects, maybe you can do sort of a simplified experiment in the lab and sort of mix some chemicals in a beaker and understand a portion of the experiment. But when it's a massive thing like a mass extinction that involves the whole planet, we really only have one Earth. We can't do a control experiment with the whole modern planet. I mean, we're doing an experiment right now, but it's a one-off. We don't have a control to compare against what we're doing today with releasing lots of anthropogenic emissions and changing the surface of the planet. So really by studying sort of past events is the only way that we can like have a controlled experiment to compare against. So none of those past mass extinctions are exactly like what we're doing today, but each of them maybe teaches us a little bit about how the planet works. And so we use those past events to really put into context our present. In a sense, we predict our future, right? Like we can see the effects of anthropogenic climate change up until the year 2022. We can use models to predict a little bit in the future, but these are past experiments that have already been run to completion. And so we can really see the long-term outcome of what happens with these big past events. And ideally, this kind of work eventually informs our decision-making. Effectiveness in political spheres is another question, but ideally it should or it would. So before I sort of dig into these mass extinctions a bit, particularly because I think there might be some geographers on the call, I just want to go through a few bits of jargon and sort of introduce the geologic timescale to everybody. So a couple abbreviations that might appear throughout this talk. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old, give or take. And so we often plot geologic time in lots of graphs with either MA, meaning mega annum or millions of years ago, or MYR, million years, and then kila annum or kiloyears, the same sort of prefix as kilogram, right? 1,000 or thousands of years ago. So a lot of the graphs and the timelines I'm going to show you might use those abbreviations. And so the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. I'm showing you here on the bottom the last 3.5 billion years of Earth's history, going from the past on the right up until the present at year 0 today. And just to sort of put this into context, I want to put a few like key events on this timeline. And notice the axis is broken in the middle. So on the right-hand side, we're zooming through 3 billion years really quickly. And the left-hand side here is just the last 500 million years. So this particular timeline starts kind of around the time where that's the last rocks that we have left on the planet. Like we have some snippets of like little minerals and clues about the early Earth, but no real rocks left before 3.5 billion years ago. And soon after that, we have some of the earliest life appearing. And really it takes a while for life to get beyond the microscopic stage until sort of the late Precambrian. You might have heard of the Cambrian explosion, maybe not, but this is around the time around 550 million years ago, where we have the rise of complex macroscopic animals that you can see with hard parts that tend to get preserved in the fossil record. And then the last 500 million years here on the left, which is the most recent bit of Earth history. To help you sort of remember and understand this word Phanerozoic, zoic comes from like the same root as like zoology, so we're talking about animals, and phanero here is the Greek, I think it's Greek for visible. So we're talking about macroscopic life that's visible in the fossil record. And this is the part where we're going to spend our time today, this most recent bit where we have the best rocks, the best record of life on the planet to understand. And within that last 550 million years, the Phanerozoic, we have what are called the Big Five mass extinction events. And I'll plot them for you on this timeline as dots, so you can sort of see where they are. There's one at the end of the Ordovician. There's one in the late Devonian. There's one at the end of the Permian, or the Permian-Triassic boundary here. And this is one that is sometimes called the Great Dying. It's the biggest of all. There's one at the end of the Triassic, and then there's one at the end of the Cretaceous, or the Cretaceous Paleogene, sometimes called the KT in sort of TV shows and stuff about documentaries about this time. This is the end Cretaceous, and this is the one that is perhaps the most famous because it's the one where we lose all the non-avian, the non-bird dinosaurs. Birds are dinosaurs, so it's all the dinosaurs that are non-birds that go extinct at that end Cretaceous mass extinction about 66 million years ago. So that's kind of a brief whistle-stop tour of the geologic past to get you sort of oriented if you're coming to us from a geography background. And just one warning, I've put time in this plot going from right to left, right where the present is on the left. It's a big thing in paleontology, and we just have arguments within our field about, are we going to put time going left to right or right to left? So unfortunately, I can't keep it consistent for this talk because I was just after the best figures, regardless of which way they go, but I'll try to clue you in. I think for most of the rest of the talk, time is going to flip around and we'll go from on the left, the past, to the right, the present. So this is an example of that, right? So this is the last 550 million years of Earth history, going from the past on the left to the present on the right. And I wanted to include this because this is a plot that sort of is one of the first ways that we figured out that we had these big 5 mass extinctions in Earth history. And this was from some researchers that spent years in dusty libraries collating all these published records of marine fossils for the last 550 million years, and just sort of tallying up the diversity of marine life. It was a huge effort. There have been some updates made since then, but one of the things that emerged from that massive effort was this plot of the number of marine families that were preserved in the rock record over time. And already in these early plots, you started to see some dips in diversity, and these are the big 5 mass extinctions that we still talk about today. So you can see that the one at the Permian Triassic, this end Permian mass extinction, why they call it the Great Dying, because it's, you know, the biggest dip in diversity of all. And this is our end Cretaceous with the dinosaurs, the non-avian dinosaurs going extinct, that is perhaps quite famous. So I'm not going to talk about all of these extinctions today. I'm going to focus mostly on the last 3 because they're the ones that I study and know a bit more about, but also they're the ones that we just have the best understanding of at the moment for a number of reasons. So the end Permian, the end Triassic, and the end Cretaceous are going to be ones that I'm going to focus on today. So if the timeline didn't do it for you, just understanding geologic history, I just wanted to also line up a few of the sort of the charismatic animals that were around at this time to give you sort of a sense of what the ecology looked like before and after some of these extinctions. So on land, starting in this timeline from the Devonian and heading forward in time towards the Triassic, the Devonian is when we start to have vertebrates invading the land. The Carboniferous, about 350 million years ago. So when we start to have the diversification of amniotes and amphibians, there's a big expansion of plant life on land in the Carboniferous, some collapse of the rainforests towards the end of that. The Permian, we often talk about that as the age of reptiles. Reptiles flourish. Here's that big Great Dying, the end Permian mass extinction. And that kind of marks the transition towards ecosystems that you might almost recognize as something a bit more modern, like both on land and in the ocean. That gets interrupted by this end Triassic extinction. And then that gives rise then to kind of the age of the dinosaurs. So in the Jurassic and the Cretaceous, extinction at the end of the Cretaceous, no more non-avian dinosaurs, and then the rise of mammals when they come to dominate. So that's kind of the picture of how these extinctions fit in. But one of the things that we've noticed is that these extinctions, they tend to coincide in geologic history with events where climate is changing as well. And so this is like an updated version of kind of a similar version of that same plot I showed you this is from the Permian up until today on the right-hand side. And it's just showing you the extinction rate. And this particular one is in the ocean over time. So where the graph goes up, that's a really high extinction level. Where the graph goes down, not so much extinction. And the ones that pop out are ones like the end Permian mass extinction here, the end Triassic, and here's the end Cretaceous. But on top of this, what's plotted in blue, the ones that are highlighted and given a name are events where we see massive warming as well. So called hyperthermal. So lots of warming at these events, rapid warming, relatively rapid warming. And that starts to sound a bit like something that we know about today, rapid warming events. And so that's why these can sometimes be quite useful to try to understand or contextualize today's anthropogenic climate change. Okay, so now to get to the heart of the science really, and talk a bit about like what caused these extinctions. And the one I want to start with is the one where I suspect many in the room will already know the answer, which is the end Cretaceous mass extinction, 66 million years ago, end of the non-avian dinosaurs. And I've given it away with a picture here, but this is the one that we're pretty sure, as sure as one can be, that it was a giant extraterrestrial impact that caused the extinction. So how did we figure this out? And how did that actually translate into the extinction? So first on the how we figured it out bit. So some of the best evidence for the extinction being caused by an extraterrestrial impact dates back to the early 1980s. And these guys, a father and son team, Lewis and Walter Alvarez, published a really important paper that that sort of solidified this understanding. And they had this really clever idea, which is that they went to a geological outcrop, a bunch of rocks where they know that, you know, the ones at the bottom here are Cretaceous and these ones are Paleogene. They know where the boundary is between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene. And they took some samples and took them back to a lab and decided to measure the concentration of a particular element called iridium. And iridium is something that occurs very rarely on Earth. Like it's here, it's an element that exists naturally. It's just present in really low concentrations in our planetary materials. Compared to sort of extraterrestrial materials, I mean, it's still rare in sort of a meteorite or a comet or whatever, but it's much more elevated in concentration in that meteor or that comet. And so their idea was, if you could measure the concentration of iridium in sort of the rocks beforehand, and then the rocks right at the extinction event where this hand is right here, and then afterwards what you'd see is a big spike, a big increase in iridium right at the extinction level. And in fact, that's exactly what they found. So this is a section in Italy where they measured this first, but after their original paper from 1980, people went around the globe to all the other places where the end Triassic mass extinction is found in the rock record and started measuring iridium levels, and found that, you know, not only do we have increased amounts of iridium right at this section in Italy, but it kind of occurs the world over. So that was on its own, perhaps one smoking gun, but since then, you know, a bunch of other lines of evidence emerged as well. So there are things that we can look at about sort of the other minerals that are preserved right at that extinction horizon to understand what's gone on. One thing is what's called shocked quartz. Quartz is a mineral that's really, really common. It's, you know, what most sand is made of. But when it's shocked, this just means that it's been subjected to like huge amounts of pressure, and it's sort of kind of fractured a bit funny. And you can see it under a microscope that, you know, the only way to get that kind of fracturing is huge amounts of pressure. So it's actually the impact itself. Then little glass spherules. So this is like little bits of Earth material that are like melted, and they sort of then crystallize and solidify back into these little spherules that are kind of found distributed quite far away as well. Locally to where the meteor hit the Earth, you find tsunami deposits, right? Like that's going to cause a big, big wave. So there are all sorts of other evidence that started to emerge. And finally, evidence of an impact crater of the right age. So there are impacts all over the planet, impact craters all over the planet. But this is a particularly big one, and it happened to be particularly at the right level about 66 million years ago to be a candidate to have caused this mass extinction. And so the crater in question is called Chicxulub. It's located in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, sort of half onshore and half offshore here. And this is sort of a gravity map that just sort of, you can see a little, you know, just in all sorts of features that geologists might measure. The white is the coastline here. You can see that ring structure really sticking out. And so there's this candidate that's probably about the right age. There's all this evidence of extraterrestrial iridium found the world over. Probably we've got the smoking gun, but the very last kind of nail in the coffin I think was found just a couple of years ago. So there's a big group of scientists that participated in a deep sea drilling expedition. So this is something that a bunch of our staff at Birmingham do. We sail with international scientists where we drill particular parts of the ocean floor or the ocean sediments to learn something about Earth's past. This particular expedition went right to the crater itself, and they drilled down into the crater in 2016. And there they're able to find the extraterrestrial dust, this iridium layer, right in the crater itself. I mean, they've now ticked every single box, and it's pretty well shown now that this is the crater, the scar of the extraterrestrial impact that caused the end Cretaceous mass extinction. Just as a brief aside, like the drilling that's done here, like I said, a bunch of us at Birmingham participate in it. If that's something that's of interest to you, we did have an exhibition a couple of years ago at our Lapworth Museum, which is housed right on campus. And you could either check out this QR code or just this website here, mysteriesofthedeep.org, where we put together like a free comic that you can download, and some other information panels that just sort of explain a bit about like international scientific drilling of the ocean and sort of how we can use that to learn about Earth's past. So do have a look if that's something of interest to you. The comic is available in a couple of formats and free to download. Okay, so we've got an impact. We know that it happened at the right time, but I've still not really answered the question of like how anything died, right? So, I mean, obviously if you're something that's living right, you know, where the crater is, right, you would have gotten blasted into oblivion, right? A direct hit, that's not survivable. But what about the rest of the planet? Things living across the other side of the globe, for example. And there are a whole number of different effects of the impact. So local and regional, obviously there's, you know, this blast, there's earthquakes, there's tsunamis. You might get buried beneath sort of the ejecta. So the impact happens and then there's material that was hit on the Earth's surface that gets ejected in all directions. Fires, acid rain, dust loading of the atmosphere, ozone loss. You can even get cooling on sort of the short term of, you know, months to years. And then on the long term, maybe even greenhouse warming and a long-term sort of warming event, which in fact we do kind of see with this end Cretaceous mass extinction. So it's kind of like death by 1,000 different cuts. There's all sorts of pressures that are introduced by that meteorite impact that last well beyond just, you know, the immediacy of when it hit. But I suppose this isn't really the best analog for what we're doing today. It's interesting, and it's interesting to see how life recovered. We can study the recovery from this extinction, but perhaps, you know, not the best analog in some senses. Okay, but to the history of the science. So you know, there's several decades of work that I've just sort of breezed by where we've kind of solidified the story of this end Cretaceous extinction being caused by a meteorite impact. Which kind of led a lot of people to think, at least for a while, for a few decades, that perhaps all the other of the big five, the other big four mass extinctions were also caused by impacts. And so there was a hunt for, you know, people would measure iridium at other mass extinction levels. They'd look for shocked quartz, they'd look for spherules. And there were even some craters that were identified that, you know, might be big enough and might be the right age to coincide with some of these other extinctions. So this one, for example, is a crater called Manicouagan that's in Canada and huge, like visible from space. Like we have pictures of it from, you know, space stations and astronauts and stuff. You know, similar in size to the Chicxulub impact in the Yucatan. And we thought for a while, you know, maybe the ages were going to be right for this to line up with the end Triassic mass extinction, but turns out it's a few million years too early. So although it's a giant crater and it was caused by a giant impact, this one didn't cause an extinction. And there's all sorts of really interesting geology to get into as to why this one didn't. But the point is that the impact explanation didn't really seem to fit for a lot of the other mass extinctions. So now what? We need to look for some other causes for some of these other extinctions. And so I'm going to return to a graph that I showed you earlier and add some new information. So this is again, the last 300 million years of Earth's history, with the Permian on the left, Triassic, Jurassic, Cretaceous, and today on the right of the bottom axis. And again, in the dotted white graph here, we're looking at extinction rate over time with the big extinctions popping out. But one thing I've added is this writing in yellow. And what all of these things are in yellow are episodes of huge volcanism. So we call them large igneous provinces. And we're talking volcano, but like not like a single volcano, like you might hear about going off on the news. We're talking major scale events. And I'll give you a sense of how big that was in a slide or two. But the way that volcanism, you know, you might hear about this or think about this for big eruptions that happen, like the Tonga one recently, is there might be some regional effects. You know, if it was really big, which the Tonga one wasn't, you know, quite big enough, we might think about, you know, a few years of sort of global cooling kind of stuff happening with aerosols being dispersed up into the stratosphere. So there can be some short-term events from like a single big volcano eruption. But with these, we're talking so much of a bigger scale. What you may or may not know is that volcanoes, well, magma contains carbon dioxide, CO2, which is a greenhouse gas. And so if you have a lot of volcanism that continues for long enough, way beyond the scale of like a single volcano erupting, you could get global warming that could last for quite a long time. And so we're no longer talking about weather, we're really talking about climate change that could be caused by volcanism. And so the kind of volcanism that I'm talking about, not only have you never seen it, but nobody alive has seen it. Within written history, there's only one example that I know of that is of an event that's at least of a similar style, if not quite anything similar in scale to the volcanism that caused these mass extinctions. And this here is a picture from Iceland, from a fissure, a volcano fissure crack, sort of that opened up in the 1780s, the early 1780s. There was sort of an 8-month period where in this region there was just basalt lava flowing out, and at quite a fast rate. This is dwarfing any kind of single volcano that is sort of in more recent history. And what happened was we ended up, you know, this Laki eruption ended up killing sort of 50% of Iceland's livestock population. There were big crop failures as well, and that led to a local famine, which I think killed something like 1/4 of the population of Iceland. It did lead to a drop in global temperatures from all that aerosol getting up into the stratosphere and cooling things. There were even crop failures as far as like Europe, possibly even related to droughts, even further afield in Africa and India. And there was extreme weather in the UK as well. I think even Benjamin Franklin, who was visiting in Europe at the time, and I think there are diary entries of him sort of talking about the strange atmospheric phenomena at the time. So really well recorded. But even this, it's a similar style to these past volcanic events that cause the mass extinctions, but it's like way smaller. So here's a map that kind of gives you a sense of scale. So obviously a map of the world, but what's popped up in yellow is I'm highlighting where there is rock at the surface of the earth that is basically the remnants of one of these large igneous or volcanic episodes. And so I'll highlight a few of them that coincide with some of these big mass extinctions that I've mentioned. So up here in Russia, these are called the Siberian traps, the biggest of all. And they coincide with the end Permian mass extinction. So we think that that's kind of the ultimate cause of the Great Dying, the biggest extinction biggest mass extinction in Earth history. Over here on the Atlantic, you know, you see sort of either side of the Atlantic in North and South America and in Africa, this thing called CAMP. This is the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. And the reason it occurs on either side of the Atlantic is because this erupted when we had Pangaea, a supercontinent, when South America fitted right here into Africa. And this event is related to the initial rifting apart of that supercontinent Pangaea. And we still have remnants either side of the Atlantic. And that coincides with the end Triassic mass extinction, which is not quite as big as the Great Dying, but still a really big one. And lastly, we have over here, I should mention the Deccan traps, which coincide with the end Cretaceous extinction. Now, I've already kind of told you that we have the answer for what caused the end Cretaceous extinction, and it's an impact, but also there was this large igneous province going off at the time, which maybe isn't the ultimate cause of the extinction, but certainly exerted some pressure on the environment at the time, maybe exacerbated things or made things a bit worse. So yeah, these are big amounts of lava that have cooled, big deposits, huge volcanism, so called large igneous province, or sometimes you'll see it abbreviated as LIP or LIPS. So how does this kill anything? How does this turn into a kill mechanism? Well, this is sort of a schematic showing you like what might have sort of happened with some of these, where you have volcanism, huge amounts of basalt pouring out at the surface and solidifying, but also maybe this igneous material is cooking rocks like coal. So, I mean, today we're heating the atmosphere by burning coal, which produces CO2. It's kind of the same process if you have magma that, you know, erupts or gets injected into coal. It's going to cook it, it's going to release CO2. So we have like a double whammy here of carbon dioxide coming from the magma, but also carbon dioxide coming from all the rock that it might be cooking if it, you know, hits in the right place where there's a bunch of coal seams. So there's a lot of carbon dioxide coming out, leading to warming. But there's also aerosols, which can do a bit of damage with sort of blocking the sunlight maybe and leading to short-term cooling. And then I wanted to kind of highlight that there's all sorts of effects on land. So it changes how materials on land weather, changes how soils work. There's all sorts of differences in terms of what gets carried by rivers then into the ocean. And that might include a lot of nutrients, a lot of heavy metals, which can be toxic. And the nutrients end up fueling algae growth. And algae can clog up all the light entering the water, but also when algae decays, it uses up all the oxygen and causes anoxia, which is A, meaning without oxygen. So this is water that's got like no oxygen in it. And, you know, animals that live in water, just like animals that live on land, need oxygen. So that's a kill mechanism. And as well, quite similar to today, when you have a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, well, you get warming. That's one thing you get, but you also get ocean acidification, where it's changing the pH of the ocean, making it more acidic. So there's all sorts of effects here from the large igneous provinces, some of which are unique to igneous activity, but a lot of which have real parallels. So this is another just way of visualizing that. You know, what does the large igneous province cause? Well, there's some direct effects of particular gases that might get released, and they cause some kill mechanisms, including like darkness, kind of like a nuclear winter situation, and shut down of photosynthesis, acid rain, and also global warming, ocean acidification, and anoxia coming largely from the emission of greenhouse gases. And you get terrestrial and marine mass extinctions. And so this has happened at a number of times. It's probably what caused the end Permian mass extinction. It's probably what caused the end Triassic mass extinction. We're pretty well sure of that. So with the last bit of my talk, I just want to finish by giving you a section about sort of comparing what came out of these volcanoes to what we're doing today. A few numbers just to sort of give you a sense of scale. So this is just a figure from the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, where we're showing, you know, the average global temperatures at the surface of the Earth from 1750 to today, and all these possible futures depending upon what our emissions futures look like, how much we emit, how quickly we stop, etc. And one of the things we can get from these past mass extinction events that tend to be caused by big global warming as well, at least in part, we can compare and say, like, well, you know, we know how much fossil fuel we've burned since 1750. How do these mass extinctions compare? Is it more? Is it less? Is it the same? And the mass of how much carbon is burned determines how much climate change you get, basically, how much warming, how much loss of oxygen in the ocean, how much ocean acidification. So we can ask how much carbon caused a mass extinction versus what we're doing today, but we can also ask how quickly did that carbon get emitted? So we know that it's been largely since the Industrial Revolution that we've emitted our carbon emissions. In fact, most of it's been emitted in the last few decades. How does the rate of carbon, how much carbon we emit per year, compare to what's happened in the geologic past? And the rate is really important for a number of reasons. And you can think about it like from a biology perspective of, how quickly the warming happens is going to determine things like whether life can keep pace via, evolutionary adaptation or maybe migration to a different habitat to sort of stay within its niche, its comfort zone. But also there are a whole bunch of ways that the Earth has for recovering from warming. The Earth has some inbuilt thermostats. It prevents us from ever running away to infinity temperature or to zero temperature. So there are some natural ways that the Earth will recover as well from what we're doing today. But these past events, we kind of want to know, did they happen quicker or slower than those natural recovery mechanisms? If anyone's sort of in geology, I'm happy to talk a bit more about those, how this all works later on. But yeah, so there's reasons we care about how much, and there's reasons we care about how quickly. So I'll just give you a couple quick examples to finish. So first with the end Triassic mass extinction, and this is the one that's related up to the opening up of Pangaea. So a really crude way to figure out how much carbon came out from this volcanism and how quickly, how much greenhouse gas and how fast, is to just go to the rocks themselves. And this is from New Jersey, I think, or Canada, one or the other. I think New Jersey, but I wouldn't swear to it. And you're looking at the red in the bottom here is Triassic rocks. And then up top here, this dark browny stuff is some of the camp lava that's sort of still preserved. And so you can go to outcrops all over the world and tally up the total volume of lava that is left from camp. And you can make some assumptions about how much carbon dioxide would have come out per cubic meter of lava and get a sort of guess as to the minimum amount of carbon that was produced by this volcanic event. And so I'm going to plot it on a graph just to compare it to today. So how much anthropogenic carbon we've released, not quite 1,000 petagrams yet. Petagrams is many, many, many grams. I think 100, 1,000, I don't know, I have to look it up. I forget every time, but it's a lot. That's the modern. And here's something like the end Triassic mass extinction, just to compare. So this extinction event was caused by volcanism, which produced way, way, way more carbon emissions than what we're doing today. And I've put an arrow on here because I know that this is a really low estimate. It's a minimum. It's probably a lot more. So took a lot more carbon to cause that extinction than what we've emitted today. We can also ask how quickly that carbon came out. How quick was this volcanic event? And the way that we do this is we just set up a fraction where we put on the top how much carbon came out totally, and then on the bottom, how quick or how long was the, did it take from the first to the last lava? And the geologists might know a little bit about radiometric dating. That's how that's done. But to give you a sense, today, anthropogenic carbon release, it's about on the order of 10 petagrams of carbon per year. And for the end Triassic, we're talking way, way, way less. Might be a bit more. I think this is, again, a low estimate, but probably not approaching the rates of what we're doing today. So the take home there is slower than what we're doing today, but also a lot more. Those are how those things compare. I was going to show one other example, but we're running a little short on time. So I'll just say, I'll just sort of summarize that the other example is this North Atlantic igneous province. And I highlight it for a couple of reasons. One, because it's close to home. So this is one of the places that we visit on our undergraduate field trips. So here's some of our first years from a pre-COVID field trip where we were at the Giant's Causeway, which is some of the remnants of that North Atlantic igneous province. And it caused a minor mass extinction event called the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, which is something like 4 or 5 degrees warming, but much, much faster than probably the big mass extinctions, the end Triassic and the end Permian. And I'll skip how we got there, but just to tell you, this is one of the fastest ones that we know about in the rock record, the fastest events, the fastest release of carbon. Again, we're talking way more carbon than what we're doing today, but not at rates that sort of compare to anthropogenic carbon release. So I'll just leave you with a few summary thoughts about the causes of mass extinctions and sort of how this translates maybe to lessons for the future. So we talked a bit about the most recent of the big three mass extinctions, the end Permian, the end Triassic, and the end Cretaceous. And we've nailed down the causes for those as being extraterrestrial impacts or massive volcanism. And many of these mass extinction events, they're warming events associated with the rapid release of carbon dioxide, and lots of the effects of this volcanism, the kill mechanisms, have really strong parallels with some of the experiments that we're running today on the surface of our planet. Of course, there's real differences with what we're doing today, but there are some strong similarities as well. To compare, the total carbon dioxide emitted that caused these past mass extinctions is much greater than the total amount of carbon that we've emitted since the Industrial Revolution. But the rate for those past mass extinctions of carbon emissions is probably much slower than what we're doing today. So there's importances of both in terms of what that's going to cause and how what we're doing today might compare. And I'll leave you then with one final thought. None of these past events, like I said, is a perfect sort of control experiment against which to compare what we're doing. There's differences all the time. But the geologic past, one important advantage that we have is we record the end of the experiment, right? Like if we're trying to think about what we're going to see into the future with IPCC reports and models, we get a good idea, but we won't know until we get there if we were right, for sure. Whereas with these geological events, we record the beginning, the middle, and the end. So we're the ones who can sort of see into the distant future and make some or inform some of our predictions about that. Yeah, so that's me done, just a little bit over time, and yeah, happy to stick around for any questions.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. You've just taken us back to the last 550 million years of Earth's history and the causes of mass extinctions, none of which I knew anything about. So I am really grateful for that insight. Now we have got quite a few questions.
Oh,
some of them, yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to pronounce the terminology, but the first one is fine. I can do this one. So the first question is, which do you think is the most interesting extinction event and why?
Oh, I'm so biased. I mean, personally, I have two picks. One is an oddball pick, is actually the end Triassic. And I'm biased because I research it. I mean, we talked about the Great Dying being the exciting one because it's the most severe, and the end Cretaceous, if you like dinosaurs, if that's your thing, that's really exciting. But the end Triassic, I think, is quite exciting because if you remember early in the talk, I said that the Triassic is kind of when modern ecosystems were established. So this is the first extinction where it sort of hits modern ecosystems. And so you kind of see how they fare through that, including like coral reefs and stuff. And also because it was really, we're getting more and more dates to understand that it was really, really fast. And that's work that I'm involved in. So because it's faster, it maybe is a bit more relevant than we thought to today. So, but I'm really biased. That's just my favorite.
Okay, the second one, do you think the Deacon Traps eruption events played any role in causing the KPG mass extinction also? Yeah, so the KPG, the dinosaur one, that I did mention that there is this Deccan Traps, there is a large igneous province, there is volcanism around that time. I think there's a couple of reasons why I don't think it's the main trigger. And one of those has to do with the dates where it sort of, it seems to have erupted over a broader interval than rather just the extinction. One reason is just we have such good control on the crater and the impact, but it did have an effect on climate. And you can sort of see some background change in the climate leading up to the end Cretaceous extinction that's probably caused by it. So it did have an effect, just not as much as some of the other ones.
And I think part of the reason has to do with what is the rock that was there when that igneous magma, intruded or erupted into it. So I mentioned with the one in Siberia that caused the Great Dying, there was a bunch of coal there. And that was an extra like CO2 boost by combusting all that coal, whereas the Deccan Traps erupted into something that was much less carbon rich, so you don't get that double boost. So I think it probably is an exacerbator, but not really the main cause of that one.
Okay, then Anna's question, yeah, I'm going to struggle with terminology. So I want to call it, you might help, Tom. Can you help?
Cenotes, I think it is. Is that how you say it? I think.
Sorry?
It's cenotes. I think the limestone
sinkholes, yeah.
Sinkholes, yeah.
So how did the crater cause this?
Oh, I don't even know. Tom, do you know?
Yeah, I think it's.
Well, we should tell everybody else what the question is about. That around this crater in the Yucatan, there are these sort of sinkholes that kind of occur in a rim around it.
Yes, if you look on Google Maps of the Yucatan, you see this sort of semicircular kind of string of lakes. And I think the most likely thought is that when you hit the impact hitting, it basically melts a lot of the rocks in that impact crater, which then changes the flow of groundwater, so that basically it becomes an impermeable layer. So you get preferential flow of groundwater around the edge of that crater structure, which then starts dissolving these kind of weak limestones that were deposited on top, and they start collapsing down. So they think, and also maybe fracturing again around that sort of line of weakness around the crater caused by the water flow. So then it is a preferential flow of water, and you get this dissolution of the above it, causing this ring of lakes.
Okay. Millie asks, in terms of the extinction of mammoths, which do you think is the most likely reason? The Younger Dryas impact, etc.
Oh, honestly, if you're asking the question, you might be more familiar with the literature than I am. I've not kept track. So most of my work is in the Mesozoic. Tom, do you, I'm going to throw you as well. Do you have a strong feeling or?
I don't. I mean, that's a big argument of the Pleistocene megafauna extinctions. Like, is it hunting and human activity, or is it climate change? And it's, I think maybe the balance is that it's a bit too coincidental that they will go out when humans migrate all over the world. And there's been a lot of climate change in the Pleistocene before that, and no big extinctions. And I guess the Younger Dryas impact event, I think that's in Siberia, isn't it? I think. So I'm not sure, the 8.2 event, how much of an extinction was associated with that might have been a local kind of effect. But I think, I'm afraid the finger is probably pointing more towards us as a species than other things.
Anna asks, could you explain briefly why the Canadian crater impact didn't cause an extinction? Yeah,
I mean, I think there's a couple reasons, but I think that the one of the main ones is what was underneath when that, what did, I guess we call the target rock, like what did the extraterrestrial impact hit? And in the case of the Yucatan, you're hitting rock that is sedimentary rock. There's probably quite a bit of carbonates and evaporites there. And basically the composition means that there's a lot more nasty sulfur kinds of things that are getting blasted out into the stratosphere, etc. Whereas in Canada, this big impact is hitting what's called the Canadian Shield. It's like some of the oldest rock on the planet. It's super stable. It's super, it's like igneous. It basically nothing's going to happen to it. You're just sort of ringing a bell and not injecting anything nasty. So I imagine there was probably, locally, nothing was happy, like it was still pretty big, but the kind of, we just don't see an extinction event that's coincident with it. Tom may know more as well, but I think there was also some questions about sort of the angle of impact of different things and whether that might matter as well. But, that gets into physics that are slightly beyond what I know about.
I think it's the gypsum. I think you said, yeah, the evaporites, maybe one of the big things.
So it's the same story, right, with the impact crater and with the volcanism, that the rock that was there when it happened kind of makes a big difference, might be the make or break as to how bad it gets. Do we erupt the magma into something nasty or not? Do we hit something nasty with the meteorite or not?
Okay. And Oliver asks, why is it thought that birds survive the Cretaceous Tertiary?
Oof. I don't know. I do know who would know in our department. It's funny, I pulled a bit of a bait and switch. I called this talk about mass extinctions, but I mostly studied the climate stuff rather than the fauna themselves. I'm not sure.
I think size is critical.
Mm.
So the body size, basically the birds are like an order of magnitude smaller than any of the dinosaurs. So they're like, before the extinction, they're hopping around at like less than a kilo. Whereas, you know, your smallest dinosaurs are, you know, many kilos upwards to tens of kilos to be huge.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I'm sure there were some birds that went extinct as well.
Yeah.
It's just that some survived.
Yeah. Yeah.
And William asks, do we have any knowledge as to why mammals specifically became dominant after the KT extinction?
I mean, with all of these extinctions, part of the answer is that you get a bit of a reset, right? With habitat niche space being kind of cleared out, and there's kind of just a run at it. Like, I mean, there's going to be more complicated answers about, you know, the particular physiology of different groups and what they're capable of, but essentially you're kind of wiping the slate a little bit clean, and in some cases just kind of first to establish and crowd everyone else out is the winner. So who survives, and then you can sort of capitalize. You know, I don't know why mammals in particular. Part of that is a roll of the dice that they made it, partially because they're small and there was just a lot of open niche space to colonize.
And then Oliver asks, why does the Madagascan LIP almost perfectly follow the coastline?
Good question. I mean, do I know much about the geology of Madagascar? I mean, a lot of these things, it could be to do with, it's not that it follows the coastline, is that the coastline follows it, kind of. That's the rock that was there. So I sort of see it the other way around. Like, why is the coast there? It's because the rock was there. Like, that's where the rock is. I don't know if that makes sense, but
And then how do we know that these are mass extinctions and not a lack of fossils in the fossil record?
Well, that's a really good one. And so the mass extinction, the way they're first defined is literally by counting up all the diversity of things. And so that's literally how many species were named in each interval. And like, some of the early estimates have gotten revised, but the big patterns of those big five, particularly the most recent ones, have really persisted, that as we improve the database, as we improve our understanding of statistics and sampling biases, that those really do stick out as times where before we had a list of species this long and after we had this list of species this long. The particular timing of, like, you know, do we see rocks where there's not much in them, and could that be due to something other than the extinction? Well, yeah, there's always rocks in any time period that don't have a lot of fossils, but it's when you take sort of that global picture together that you get a really strong sense that, yeah, diversity really did plummet. But that's not to say there aren't still things to learn about the details, but I think those, particularly the most recent mass extinctions, are pretty well established.
Then I guess a follow-on from that one, Ellen asks, what do the microfossils show?
Oh, if only we had a microfossil expert with us on the call. That's Tom's jam.
I guess, yeah, for the KPG, the microfossil record really give us probably the best view of the rates of extinction, and really tying, you know, because these are sand-sized grains, the small, tiny shells, single-celled organisms. So there's almost a complete fossil record if you go out into the deep ocean. So you can sample all the way through the very latest part of the Cretaceous into the very beginning of the Paleocene, like the section that Sarah showed at the beginning, this white to red kind of transition. So you can just tell, you know, you can see that these fossils are existing right up to the boundary, and then they just disappear at the boundary. Very few survive and then kind of re-radiate. So for the KPG extinction, they're fantastic at telling us that that really is a very rapid extinction event. The records are much less good from the carbonate microfossils and the Permo-Triassic and from the End-Triassic, just because they weren't so abundant at those times. So it's a bit harder. But for the KPG, there's a very good record.
Yeah, if you do go to that mysteriesofthedeep.org website where that comic book that we made a few years ago. It shows you a lot of like, it explained at a very, very basic level of like the kinds of things we could learn from those microfossils. It's not just about the extinction, but their shells are basically chemistry labs for us that have recorded everything that happened. That's how we know how hot it got or how acidic the ocean was, etc. They're fantastic.
James asks, how do you determine the duration of a mass extinction?
Yeah, tricky. It's really, really tough to determine that, because almost to figure out that there's a mass extinction, you have to pick some time bins and say, well, I'm going to call all of this the very end of the Triassic and this the beginning of the the Jurassic or whatever. And if you try to narrow those time bins down so that you can define how many species were alive, at some point you're just sort of relying on really small numbers of things. So it is a bit difficult to tell, but we do get better understanding sometimes from like the climate actually. So we can reconstruct like the climate, figure out how long the warming lasted, when was the peak warming, how long, and really the microfossils again are the best way here. So like with dinosaurs, we don't have that many fossils, right? And there aren't that many. So you have these really big time bins where it's like, here's the late Permian, here's the early Jurassic. With microfossils, you can start to narrow that window down and sort of ask how long it was lasting. But it's always somewhat arbitrary when you call the start and the stop. It's a judgment call.
And I guess this one is linked to what you just said about the evidence. Ryan asks, since roughly 71% of the world is made up of oceans, would you say that there could be more fossils and other evidence linked to the extinctions?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Is it whether there's marine evidence for extinctions, or I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I don't.
It's probably not you, Ryan. It's probably me, because it's
I guess the marine,
quite late.
One thing to say is that the marine fossil record is much better than the terrestrial record.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
those original Sapkowski curves and stuff are mostly marine invertebrate, I think, records. So they're seashells effectively. And
yeah.
So that the marine,
marine evidence, yeah,
well kind of sampled, and it probably gives you your best. Obviously the dinosaurs and things are the most exciting. But actually,
I disagree.
marine fossils are much better. So you're right. In that sense.
We know a lot more, from the marine records than we do from the terrestrial in that sense. Yeah, even though you say it's 70% of the surface, most of that ocean is much younger. So it's oftentimes like marine rock that's actually been attached to a continent. So it's like old coral reefs or old seabeds that are part of the continent. So it's preserved on land, but it's marine rock for the older ones. The ocean floor is fairly young, keeps getting destroyed and remade.
And we've got about a minute left, and I'm going to join these two questions together to finish us off. So would there be intelligent life without mass extinctions? And are there any more mass extinctions on the way?
Well, yeah, or would there be intelligent life without it? Oh, who knows? I mean, probably. I mean, I think there are intelligent things that were here before. I don't know. I think mass extinctions are always going to happen. So it's just a question of whether a planet evolves intelligent life. Mass extinctions will happen. 6 mass extinction. Yeah, I was expecting somebody might ask it, and it's a tricky one. I mean, I think yes, there's a lot of extinction that's happening at the moment. Whether it ends up being the scale of these past ones is still kind of remains to be seen. I just don't want anyone to take away a nihilistic message from this, that like everything's screwed and we're all doomed. It's a question of degree, right? So it's always just going to be a question of like there's more harm that could happen and we can stop that. But yeah, it's not great. And it could be worse. I guess that's the hopeful bit.
Just to end on a positive note, I wanted to know how you got into this. So can you just give us a quick, how did you get to study this?
Sure. So, well, you might have heard from my accent that I'm American. So I grew up in New York City, and in the States, when you go to college, it's not quite like the UK. You don't pick a major, like you don't pick a degree. You just go to a college and then take classes and figure it out. So I thought meteorology was really interesting in junior high school, and I thought earth science sounded like meteorology, so I took it, but just to fulfill a science credit, and kind of fell in love. So I guess earth science in the States, people who study it at university, they often say it's like a found subject, that they sort of find it when they get there, and yeah, get really excited. So yeah, I studied earth science, and then decided I liked research and wanted to keep going with it, and haven't kind of looked back since. Yeah.
Great. Oh, well, really fascinating, Sarah, and thanks so much for offering this talk to A-level students and their teachers tonight. If we were all going to be in a room together, I would say let's give Sarah a round of applause, but I'm sure each and every one of you would thank Sarah. And just to say that our next talk is on the 17th of February, again, same time, 5 till 6, and it will be Dr. Austin Barber. He is one of our planners in the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences, and he'll be talking about designing the post-COVID city. So lots of link there to urban geographies and planning. So we'll leave it there. Thank you, everybody. Good night, and have a nice evening.
Thanks very much for coming.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Great questions. I want to ask. Oh, we stopped recording.
Oh yes.
Then I can ask my question.
1 second.